back at the SID event. They're increasingly exciting and engaging. They have always been, but more and more so all the time. Kudos, Stacey, for putting together another great panel. As I was looking over the bios, I realized we had such a breadth of experience, institutionally, experientially, in geographies and themes. And I know you all want me, because you have them yourselves, to read every single word of every bio, and that should take us through the first half hour, right? No. So I'll give you a few highlights to introduce who we have and why I'm so personally excited to be part of this discussion. And think about this as you think of your own questions that you may want to ask. To my right, so I suppose, let me leave it there. My right is Jason Singer, a senior economist at DAI. He's had a lot of different kind of experiences that will add value to this conversation. Worked at the African Development Bank, which has really interesting relationships with country governments. He's worked in Indonesia on economic growth, which I think is one of the key issues that's out there right now. He's worked for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which at its heart is about promoting country ownership. It was probably one of the first US development agencies to so explicitly embrace that as its reason for being. And he's worked at the National Security Council in the White House, trying to implement this from in his position as Director of International Finance. So there's a lot of meat in there for you to ask interesting questions of him. To my immediate left, Paul Miller worked for one of my favorite development organizations, Catholic Relief Services, for more than 20 years, or most of it in CRS, has worked in a whole range of geographies, including Haiti, which is on everyone's minds right now, in Brazil, which is a fascinating player on the world stage right now, in Senegal, and led the Africa team for CRS over his time. He's also been at USAID and the United Nations earlier on in his career. So a lot of depth on both policy and on practice. I should say right now he's really involved in policy and trying to make sense of all the reforms that are moving forward, because he's the foreign aid advisor for CRS. So if you've got questions about the QDDR, hope you know what that means, we're not going to tell you, the Presidential Policy Directive, any other questions, I'm sure Paul will be happy to entertain those. On my far right is Fred Tipson, who brings lots of experience as the director of the Washington office of the United Nations Development Program, which is the United Nations preeminent program trying to deal with issues like how do we cultivate economic growth in these contexts, both in non-conflict settings, and I work closely with UNDP in places like Afghanistan, so they deal with it across the board. But very interestingly, not only in terms of thinking of multilateral engagement, Fred worked in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for years, I think it's in the range of 5 or 6 years. So he would have a very clear sense of how these discussions that are ongoing now in Washington are going to affect and implicate those discussions. And he's trying a disclaimer, but ignore the shake of the head. I'm sure he's very thoughtful about it. Lex Kassenberg on my far left, former CARE colleague of mine. I worked in CARE for many years, and Lex had a reputation in CARE of always wanting the cushy job. That's why he spent 5 years in Afghanistan, and before that 5 years working on Somalia and South Sudan. Here's one of these people who doesn't just know intellectually what it is like to try and make these things we're talking about work in difficult settings, but who knows it there. He's lived it for a very long time, and so if you have thoughts or questions around what it means to make all of this stuff work when the situation doesn't necessarily work with you, I'm sure Lex would be interested to engage. Anyway, I'm delighted, as you can tell, I hope, to be able to be around this group of very thoughtful and experienced people with the breadth of knowledge and ideas that they have. The format we thought we would take is just to have a discussion rather than do the 10 minutes from each person and then Q&A from the floor. So we're going to take about now maybe in the range of 45-50 minutes till 10 after to ask some questions of the panelists, but we really do want to save at least 20 minutes, hopefully a little more, for you to ask some of your own questions. So please think what you would like to see us talk about more, what you'd like to get a direct answer to if you don't feel it's been addressed. Disclaimer, folks are here in their personal capacities. If you want a real debate, let's not ask people to always espouse their institutional view. They're going to say what they think is the most interesting and useful thing they can say for the discussion, so please don't quote them as their institutional policies. And one last thing, just to set it up. as I was thinking about this, you could actually take the question country-led and donor coordination in 3 different ways. And I thought it might be a useful way to actually structure the discussion a bit, to look at all 3 different ways. Okay? So one way you could take the question, how do you be country-led and what do you do with donor coordination, is to ask the question, who should be in charge? The donors or the country themselves? So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. But there's another way to ask the question. In terms of who within the donor structure should be making the calls on prioritization, should it be at the headquarters level? Should it be in Washington or in Europe? Or should it be country-led in terms of the mission having a greater say? And the mission perhaps being able to listen to its partners who should have a greater say, because there have been some big changes in recent years. And then the final way you can actually take the question, country-led, is what is it that we consider success? Are we going to be measuring success in terms of themes or sectors, like working on governance broadly or working in the health sector? Or are we seeing actually a country-led measure of success, where you actually are looking to see if whole countries are doing better, are growing more equitably? So we're going to look at all 3 and have a little bit of discussion around each of those. I'm going to start by asking a question, and then I'm hoping that the panelists will talk to each other and you'll hear less from me. I'll only intervene when I think I could ask another question. I won't be opinionating, and we're going to start right away. So hopefully you all understand the setup. The first question is around who should be in charge. The countries themselves or the donor community that's trying to help them. And of course, there's an easy answer to that question, but it actually could get a bit more complex. So I'm going to turn this one over to Fred, and I'm going to ask if you could think a little bit around contexts where you have a country that has some level of political capacity and some level of demonstrated political will to do the right thing. Who should be in charge? And what are we doing about it?
Well, let me telegraph my views on all 3 of those areas by saying I think the trick in development is how you interact. You've sort of given us a binary way of looking at it, and I think the challenge is how you have donors interacting with country ownership, how you have the field interacting with headquarters, and sectors, needless to say, interacting with the broader country approach. In the interest of full disclosure, I have very little experience in the field, unlike some of my colleagues. I did work before I joined UNDP with UNDP in Mozambique and South Africa and Namibia to a small extent. So I have the perspective of looking from outside UNDP at UNDP, but a lot of what we try to do here in Washington is explain the organization in much the same terms that you've sort of set us up for. In many ways, UNDP is a very field-centric organization. It's a very distributed, decentralized organization. So the field is key. But needless to say, there has to be some kind of cohesion that the organization sells itself as providing to donor governments and, needless to say, partners who aren't based in the field. What to me is the challenge is to get beyond the bureaucratics of donor coordination, and we'll talk a lot more about that. Because you can have the best donor coordinated, country engaged, long-term development plan, but if it doesn't translate into the way things actually happen in the country, it's a facade, and too often that's what is produced, is a facade that doesn't sort of take root in the country. So that's my first reaction.
That's great. Other thoughts on this question? Do we feel that we're making some kind of progress towards empowering countries who have some level of political will and capacity on this front? We talk it. Lex?
Well, I think so. I'm from the Netherlands. That's something that you didn't mention.
Like I say, all conflict-ridden countries.
Oh, yes. If I look at my government, the Netherlands, they have adopted a policy that countries where they consider that there is a good governance, they basically give a blanket amount of money. They said it's up to you to decide how you use it. It's a very limited level of accountability for the money as well. And the feedback that I receive is that in these countries it's actually working quite well. Unfortunately, I think if you look over the globe and the number of countries that we work in, the number of countries where you can actually do this is very limited, and admittedly not every government agrees with that kind of approach that the Dutch are taking, but I think it's working.
Yeah. Jason.
Thanks. I think I would agree with Fred that sort of framing it in a binary way may be a bit of a false way. It depends on the country, it depends on the donor, it depends on donor host country budgets, it depends on the capacity of host country budgets. Take one example, I think you've seen in the United States a little bit more of an interest and some movement forward towards budget support, which in the past was really a third rail. When I was at the African Development Bank, it's very interesting because the Netherlands and other European donors who've had a lot more experience on budget support were very much in support of allocating funds to the bank that way. Other donors, a lot more cautious in trying to square these together with, of course, you have a greater than 50% membership of African countries themselves, real country ownership. It's a fascinating political process that we're in the sort of evolutionary stage now. So I think the rhetoric is getting better towards country ownership. I think more people are citing the Accra Agenda, the Paris Declaration, but it is a process.
Okay, well let me just provoke you one little bit more on this, and maybe Paul, you want to jump in, or maybe others do. Let's say we take Secretary Clinton at her word, and what she's sort of saying is, look, for too long we've been setting up these parallel systems. We talk country ownership, but we're just not delivering it. And as a consequence, the partners, many of us work for partners who receive this funding, are duplicating and substituting capacity rather than really building it. And the only way to really build it is to let them have the money. So do you see, and you see some of the newer policies of USAID in their procurement policies, for example, what they're saying is, you know, whether you're the United Nations, whether you're a for-profit contractor, whether you're a traditional NGO partner, if we're in a context where they have proven some political capacity, they've proven some political will, we're going to be putting much more money with and through them, and we're going to be spending less money on partners like you. And we want to know, are you okay with that? Do you think that's wise? Are you concerned about it? So what are your thoughts if that is the direction of things? And you can please be free to tell me it's not.
It is in part. I would say, first of all, I'd make the distinction between aid effectiveness and donor effectiveness. And the donor coordination is coming out of a commitment to aid effectiveness, in which theory there's the donor governments, there's the developing country governments, and in theory there are also a lot of other actors who we haven't really talked about. So when you say donor, does that include the Gates Foundation, which is a huge, not only in terms of financial, but also intellectual and other influence. So I think it's important to look at it that way. I think it's a very healthy thing that the U.S. government is thinking about, well, the way in which we build capacity of local organizations and local governments. A country-led strategy is important in those countries where it can happen. The question is what does country-owned mean? And we've already mentioned some of the dilemmas around that. But I would also say that this is also coming from an organization which, again, has been, in the words of this administration, eviscerated over the past 20 years in terms of USAID. There have been, at least there's 20 other U.S. government organizations that do some form of international assistance. So can we first coordinate the U.S. government assistance before, or do we need to before we start working more closely or continue to work better with our European or other donors? So I think those are some pretty important issues out there that we need to begin talking about. And again, when I say the U.S. government, I don't just mean the Treasury or USDA. I'm also talking about the U.S. military. And since 2005, stability operations are equal in importance to combat operations. And for the military, they believe they need to do relief and development, sometimes in large projects in various different kinds of settings, not just complex settings.
That's great. One last question for you in this area. If it's true that there is this commitment and there is this need to bring coordination, and you're seeing a lot of the newer mechanisms grapple with these challenges, the high-level forum on aid effectiveness started with the Paris Declaration and all that. There's going to be another meeting in Seoul. They're very focused on state-led development, on putting the state back into the equation. How are we, as a group of thinkers, responding and reacting to that? Do we think that's appropriate? Do we think that country-led development means state-led development? What's your, or should mean more state-led development? What's your thinking around that? Fred, would you?
Sure. Well, this just highlights how much countries differ, and how the answer cannot be a generic sort of summation of learning on that issue. In a country like Nepal, where Lex has been very experienced, or Tunisia now, and how different those settings are in terms of government capacity, the nature of culture, the challenges that the economy faces, and so forth. Translating the objective of country ownership, which I think everybody shares, into a realistic engagement with a government that in many cases has limited capacity to execute. Some of them do. Some of them have too much capacity to execute, and they stifle and smother other parts of the economy and the civil society sector. But that's the trick, is how you get the right chemical reaction in a given location. And too often, unfortunately, the conversations that go on in the higher headquarters-driven and conference-driven conversations just don't get down clearly enough to individual cases.
Right.
And I think that's becoming more and more the trick in development. It's an obvious point that every country differs, every culture differs. But finding the way bureaucratically to execute that in a very complicated and sometimes chaotic donor environment is proving to be, I think, one of the big challenges.
Right. Well, Lex, did you want to say something?
Well, I totally agree with Fred. What I would like to add here is that, you know, one of the big challenges that we very often face at the field level is that governments in, let's say, the third world countries feel that it is their money and they should implement it. What they do not accept very often is that even if you look at the Western world, governments have limited capacity and cannot do all the work. So how, in an effective way, do you engage civil society in the implementation of your activities? And that is building a level of trust, I think, between the government and the civil society organization. It may be local civil society, it may be international NGOs, the UN, and that is very often where you have, I think, a bit of a challenge.
Right.
And if you allow me, what I think is a really interesting exception, and you're aware of that as well, Paul, because you work there, it's actually in Afghanistan, where a lot of donors put a lot of money in a program that's called the National Solidarity Program, where all the money is going to the government of Afghanistan, but the government in turn then hands out that money to national and international NGOs to actually implement the activity. And in a country where you have to work under extremely difficult circumstances, it's one of the most successful programs. And that's quite interesting, actually.
Yes. Well, that sort of takes me to this second question, or actually second part of the first question. It's one thing to be thinking about contexts where there is a real level of both capacity and will, and you see that now in the Partnership for Growth countries that are trying to implement President Obama's presidential policy directive, Ghana, Tanzania, El Salvador, which are relatively both capable and trying to deal with development. But what do you do in a context where it is so obvious that the capacity is lacking? And yet, as Lex says, and Lex, I'm going to come back to you on this, the National Solidarity Program, $1 billion, 25,000 villages. Why did they do this program? Because even in those contexts, even when you have a weak government, you desperately need that government to have legitimacy with its own people. And if you're doing all the programs for them, they're not building up their governance capacity and they're not gaining that legitimacy. So even, let's assume the worst. Let's assume a lack of capacity, and let's assume a lack of political will. Even in those contexts, don't we need to grapple harder with the challenge of how do we get the country to lead responsibly? Lex, back to you with Afghanistan, and then I'll throw it back up to this side.
Afghanistan is obviously a challenging example because of a government that is not necessarily functional at all levels, to put it mildly. I think, though, that it's incredibly important for implementing agencies as well as for donors to come up with programs where we have the opportunity to build the capacity, good governance at all levels. It's with the government itself, it's with civil society, and good governance, to go back to that example of national solidarity, is really working at the community level, organizing communities then to so that they can identify their priorities, and that these priorities, through the government system in that case, are funded. And you can really see that even though the country as a whole is in chaos, at the local level, at the root level, you know, it's really establishing a level of well, both solidarity and as well as local competence to effectively organize themselves, and that is filtering up to the different levels. It hasn't reached the top yet, I suspect, but I think it's a good way of strengthening this type of.
Jason, any comments at all? But I mean, Indonesia wasn't an easy context in which to work out how to help a government help itself.
Right. So, and just to be clear, a bit of a correction. I did not work for MCC, I worked for AID on behalf of MCC on the threshold, just in case it gets back to the MCC folks. In Indonesia, one of the elements that we were implementing was trying to promote an increased immunization rate. Indonesia used to have one of the best immunization programs across the board for its youth. And I think in the fall of Suharto and the Asia financial crisis, just such a massive country, that fell off a bit. So one of the programs we had was to try to bring this back and promote it. The national government, certainly we had to have a dialogue, and frankly this was at a time when their Minister of Health had certain issues going on with avian influenza and a dialogue with the US, which was very tense. But really, where does somebody get immunized? It's out in the field, it's out at the local level. And so working with local governments, working with associations of midwives, frankly, we created a immunization merit badge with the Boy Scouts. Indonesia has the largest Boy Scout population in the world, as you can imagine. So looking across at civil society, looking across at local governments and the capacities, the wives of each local governor have what they call a sort of community group that they can promote. So we had to work up and down the spectrum, and then that extended off into Switzerland with the World Health Organization, which compiles the international statistics to make sure they were capturing and recognizing what was being done in Indonesia. So it really is a comprehensive effort if you're going to have an impact.
That's great. Fred, if I could switch gears a little bit and just ask the last question on this. You're constantly educating policymakers and politicians in Washington on what development is about, why it's important, why the work of UNDP needs to be well understood. So you know the environment, you work with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Trying to persuade people of local country ownership in contexts where there's corruption. And sort of helping policymakers and politicians understand that development requires some level of risk, but sensible risk. How easy or difficult is that?
That's the point, I think. To do development is to take risk. To make changes is to take risks that it won't always work out. Corruption is one of the least understood phenomena, I think, in developing countries. And the word is thrown around as if it's always a matter of rich people stealing money from the public purse. Very often, the word covers a whole range of different kinds of deficiencies, very often those of capability. And it's very important that it not be always turned into a moral issue. Not that there aren't moral dimensions to some of the kleptocracy that occurs in some of these countries, and it shouldn't be tolerated, but actually building up the capacity of a government to use money effectively is a challenge that involves risk. It involves trying to build up their capability to do their own auditing functions, to do their own, public expenditure, taxation systems, and so forth. And there will always be, in any country, some level of siphoning, of bad behavior that occurs when you're talking about funding streams in particular. And the tolerance for that, I think, is often just unrealistically low among the donor community. But it also has to do with just time frames. We've become so short-term driven in our expectations for what needs to be shown as a result that the most important things, which to my mind have to do with political development, which take a lot longer to do, are underplayed, underfunded, underattended to, and misunderstood. And so they don't get the attention and funding that's necessary to create institutions that function effectively and avoid the sloppiness that can easily turn into serious corruption.
That's great. Paul, I'd like you to speak to that if you could, but I'm going to set up the next question if I could, because I think it's related. The second way that we talked about what country-led means is the distinction between who within the donor machinery is actually making the decisions around prioritization. Should it be at the country level? Should it be at the headquarters level? Just to be, and please push back if you think I'm off, I think over the last 20 years we've seen a sucking sound out of the countries into headquarters type decision making, and now we are seeing USAID and others try to reinvest back into countries. Is this a good thing? Is it happening? Is it going to lead to real change? And please feel free to respond to.
Well, I think I want to reinforce Fred's point about development as its political component. And so again, going back to the idea of development effectiveness and thinking about political empowerment of the citizens to hold their own government accountable. Some of the most promising reforms and movements have to do with aid transparency. In fact, not just aid transparency, but transparency of resources, particularly local resources, which sometimes come into the international market, shall we say, whether there's minerals or any other kind. So I think there's some very promising things about the aid transparency that relates to country ownership. Because if the citizens can see, we see how that World Bank project is proceeding. We see who are the contractors who are implementing the dam construction, or we see exactly how it's working, or for that matter, any other program, then I think then we're a little farther down the road to not only country, but societal-led development and country-owned development. To the question about where the locus of decision within particular donors, again, I will just reinforce what I said. My experience as a very know-nothing 23-year-old in Haiti, hired by the aid mission to be the gopher for the mission director. I was called the lowest form of life.
That was last year, by the way.
Yeah, lowest form of life on the mission as a personal service contractor. But here was the case, pre-Baby Doc, Jean-Claude Duvalier still in power, the mission and the U.S. Embassy saying we can work with those technocrats that Baby Doc had hired. A lot of supporting the local government, in this case the Duvalier regime, because there was hope. But I think one of the reasons they were able to do that was because, again, the distance. And the plasticine era, my wife, as a music stringer, would send in her stories by telex from Senegal 20 years ago. So I think that there is a kind of a re-centralization that has to do with information sources that are now everywhere. But it also has to do with the fact that in the case of the USAID, a diffusion of power. And the apocryphal story of Condoleezza Rice setting the F process in motion was, can you tell me how much aid is going into that country and what it's for? And she couldn't get an answer. Unfortunately, the consequences was perhaps the idea wasn't so bad, but the consequences were again, throwing into motion all kinds of problems in terms of implementers on the ground and lack of clarity, not only about the rules, but the time frames. And again, if you're working with local partners who don't know the funding sources, again, that it caused a number of kinds of disruptions. It also confronted that problem of how do you tell your government counterpart that they live in a fragile country. So interesting, all the dilemmas around the labeling of countries.
And just one follow-up. You obviously, as a foreign aid advisor, are watching the QDDR, Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review of the State Department, carefully. You watched, before that, the President's Policy Directive number 7, which laid out some guidance. Do you think these are significant or meaningful steps towards putting the power back into the officers on the ground as they also try to get a better understanding along the lines of Condoleezza Rice's question of what they're actually doing in the world? Are you seeing a transfer of authority and capacity and importance to the fields?
First question, I think the Presidential Directive on Development is incredibly important and very positive in many ways, and there are many elements of the QDDR as well. The focus on conflict and conflict prevention, important. A lot of it, though, is about internal, getting the U.S. government getting its own house in order. And the problem is, how do you implement country-owned strategies when they're hiring new AID people as quickly as they can, but they also have all of these other bureaucracies, aid bureaucracies within the U.S. government. The theory in the QDDR is that the ambassador as CEO will sit down with all these diverse interests and groups, from the person who represents the Regional Combatant Command to the Commerce attaché and others and kind of hash out a strategy. But when you have multiple objectives for U.S. foreign policy, which is not just about development, but it's about selling things, or in cases in which some of our 8 darling countries are the ones who don't allow civil society to even to breathe a peep, or to assemble 3 people on more than 3 people at a time on the street in a certain East African country, let's say, which gets a lot of money. So those kinds of dilemmas and conflicting objectives mean that even if aid steps up, starts to fund local governments and local organizations more effectively, they're going to have some difficulty sorting those out. Last point, sorry to keep talking, is we, as those who are working with implementing partners, particularly in our case civil society and the Catholic Church, which also works in so many areas like health and education, we need to share some of the methodologies that we use to engage civil society, to help those people who are working on the ground to work with these local governments when they come up with a plan, when they implement, and then to evaluate it. And that's where I think the U.S. government is going to have some difficulty.
Please.
Yeah, just a couple of additional points. I think that I frankly personally support development being one of the 3 Ds of national security, but I just think it's inevitable. If you have that, you accept it, you incorporate it, it has continued on from the previous administration. Inevitably, you are now treating development through a national security framework. And so the issues of development effectiveness, coordination, country ownership are always going to circle back through that framework at one degree or another. Just another point, all of the complexities that we know about on the U.S. side, I'll just take, whether it's MCC, DOD, USAID, Health and Human Services, all of those various myriad organizations and the ambassador's CEO, we just need to keep in mind, on the host country side, it is just as complex. Basically, I can only imagine being in the U.S. government, if somebody plumped down a big bucket of money at an interagency meeting, the debate and the dialogue that would go on to figure out where does that go, how is it allocated. Imagine what's going on the host country side, and I think a lot of times we forget that because they do have their processes, and we may have one counterpart, but there is a whole institutional framework going on their own side that it's very helpful to understand sometimes if you want to really achieve country ownership and understand how to put the incentives in place to achieve that.
Lex, your thoughts? And as an implementer, CARE still gets a good chunk. I think it's about 30–35% of its money from the U.S. government. It matters to your practice where decisions get made there. Are you talking with a mission director who's actually got a lot of discretion? Are you finding that you're increasingly implementing things that were decided elsewhere? Have you seen a change? What change would you like to see? Or feel free to ignore any of that and say something else.
Well, I really think, Paul, to first answer your question, it really depends on the country. I think in places like Nepal, where I'm based presently, it's probably more left up to the mission. But if you have complex situations like Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, it's probably a different issue, and that's what I wanted to respond to basically, or add to it. It's a different dimension that we have not brought up, and I agree with my colleagues here on what they said. But what I really notice is that there seems to be an increasing trend of specifically talking about the donors, where you may ask the question, is the funding that donors provide really going to the best interests of the country, or is it to forward the political interests of the donor? And that is a real, concern and a real challenge, I think, for us, especially in complex settings like Pakistan and Afghanistan, where I would think that increasingly the funding is going to forwarding or promoting the political interests of the donor. And that is a development of concern, I would say.
That's a really interesting hypothesis. Fred, I might turn that one over to you, but put it this way, because you know I like binary questions. Would it be the case that where the country is important for, say, immediate political and national security priorities, what we see is that decision-making tends to be more driven from the center? Whereas when you've got a country where a donor, say the US government, is more engaged purely because of the development outcomes or the development imperatives and more driven by national security or diplomatic outcomes, there may be more discretion for the field in the main. Is that been something you've seen in your experience as you talk about development programming around the world with the US government?
Well, I guess I have sort of a schizophrenia, having been in the U.S. government to a degree, but now being a UN official and not, I can't look at the world from just a U.S. perspective,
Right.
which is not always easy to do. And particularly in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other places that are such intense national security interests of the United States. But the UN, if it's going to be of value to the U.S. to the degree that I think it can, has to maintain a certain distance from whatever the particular security agenda may be of the United States or indeed the UK or any other strong government. The difference between stabilization and development can be huge. Sometimes it isn't huge. I mean, sometimes just doing what we would otherwise say is development has a stabilizing effect. But where there's an ongoing insurgency, it tends to be less and less the case that that's true. You need to do things to calm the situation down, to dampen the conflict, which doesn't necessarily mean you're creating the kinds of changes, particularly political changes, that development typically implies. Part of my argument to U.S. officials these days, particularly in the context of the broad review of the QDR, which raised all the right issues and was really a remarkable process, is nevertheless, where do you see the UN agencies as providing a unique value, not just a multilateral dimension, but a UN dimension? Is there anything left to the UN brand that's worth preserving? And to do that, you've got to empower it in a way that has some distance from your own particular agenda in any particular country. And unfortunately, in many countries, at least on the part of some of the terrorist organizations, the UN is regarded as being nothing different from the U.S. or at least the coalitions that are involved in those conflicts. And we're paying the price in terms of loss of life of our own people. We become a soft target for lots of terrorist organizations. But that whole issue of what's the value of multilateral that's different than simply USAID returning to being a very strong, very professional, very effective organization in its own right. And that's a tough issue. We can get into some of the challenges that I think multilateral cooperation, and particularly UN cooperation, introduces, if you want to.
And increasingly important. Paul, did you have something there?
Yes, I mean, again, I think I'm thinking of the challenges of donor coordination in complex settings, and again, a colleague of mine just testified about Eastern Congo, so I can't but think of MONUSCO, one of the largest peacekeeping forces in the world in Eastern Congo, but also the failure of donors to coordinate on security sector reform, admittedly with a very challenging government partner. In fact, perhaps one of the most challenging situations, but on any measure a failure. The multi-donor trust funds for South Sudan, again, not as effective as we had hoped. Yet the UN, I think, is indispensable, both in terms of its independent agencies, its peacekeeping forces, etc. So there's a lot there that I think is worth looking at in terms of what hasn't worked well in terms of donor coordination with and through the UN. But I think on the humanitarian side there have been significant reforms. I just want to mention another multilateral example which I think is working to some degree with all the challenges, and that's the Global Fund for AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And I took a look at the CCMs, the country coordinating mechanisms, and it's remarkable because not only does the government has an appropriately large role, but there's a 40% quota, or at least a hope for a 40% quota for non-governmental organizations. Implementing principal recipients and sub-recipients can be local, can be international. CRS is in some countries a principal recipient. We're also a sub-recipient to local organizations in terms of the implementation. We're trying to get our partners to the table with all the challenges that implies. And it's one of the reasons that I'm very glad that our organization and others supported at the time that PEPFAR came around to also support funding for the Global Fund. Because I think it's a different mechanism which is building ownership, again, with all the challenges and the conflicts of interest, which are huge. We're also talking about large contracts for bed nets and for all kinds of implementation. There are also a number of private sector organizations involved and businesses who are involved. And so, again, is that the perfect model? No, but it's going forward in a way that I thought was impressive, and that we've also been trying to evolve, getting our partner to the table, our local partner, so that that dialogue between local government and local partner can take place. In our case, we want the Catholic healthcare system to also be part of the discussion. In some cases, it's 30 or 40% of the system.
Right. So Jason, the next question is for you, and I'm going to switch us to the last gear of our three lenses on country-led. In August last, President Obama made a speech at the MDGs where he said, we're no longer going to measure our success in development looking at projects. We want to know if we're making a difference at a bigger level. And he started to talk about whether countries are actually working more effectively and what it takes to help a country work more effectively. And I think that was one of the strong forces behind the Presidential Policy Directive, which has picked 4 countries to see if they can stimulate economic growth. The initiative is called the Partnership for Growth. And it is explicitly designed not to look at a sector, but to look at a whole country. And I have to say, we monitor, I think all of us do in different ways, what's going on in the global development discussion. People are increasingly talking in this way, that economic growth, looking at where the G20s are and the new big players are. It's really now about understanding macroeconomics a lot better. It's about understanding how growth actually helps the poor, or whether it does. So there's a bunch of questions in there. And so the question is, really, is any of this, does this resonate for you? Are we now starting to see that when people talk about success in development, we're increasingly looking at whether whole countries are succeeding in terms of both economic growth and whether that growth is having a meaningful impact for the people living in that country? What are you saying? You're an economist who's worked in a number of different institutional perspectives.
Good question. Thanks. Unfortunately, I have to leave early. No, it's very good question.
Lock the doors.
I think if you look, I mean, growth is always, there's always been this debate, and there always will be, about what do we want to focus on, economic growth or poverty reduction, and same side, 2 sides of the same coin. That doesn't stop the debates happening. I think what's changed over the years is, the Washington Consensus was originally designed really for a very specific time and framework in Latin America with very specific macroeconomic issues going on. That being said, it morphed into something that was taken up as a sort of mantra by people. Growth is good, follow the Washington Consensus. If you follow this, you will grow, and growth is good. Now, separate debate about sort of what happened there with the Washington Consensus. I think what people recognize is there's a second generation of reforms, and John Williamson himself, grandfather or father of the Washington Consensus, said, if you had to do it over again, he would have highlighted equitable growth, distribution. And in fact, what you see in a lot of the administration's speeches over and over again is broad-based economic growth. That is the term. And not to parse the words too finely, but I think there's a recognition that it's not just growth in and of itself, it is broad-based economic growth. And so that does entail governance, that does entail public administration systems, tax systems, that does entail involvement of labor. You're seeing a lot more focus on labor now, whether it's through USTR and trade agreements or engagement by the USG and others. What is the role of labor in these countries when it comes to their markets? So at the same time, you're seeing changes in the international governance institutions. I mean, you mentioned it, the G20, G8's gone, dead. I mean, we now live in an era of the G20. You're seeing changes in the governance structure of the World Bank, of the IMF. These are things that used to be with the US Treasury Department that never would have imagined during the age of financial crisis that you would have seen some of these changes in governance that have happened. So I think what we're seeing is a recognition that there's greater country ownership, and that growth in and of itself is not enough. It has to be owned by the countries, and it has to be recognized to be broader based.
Do those comments resonate for you? Fred?
Yeah, I can't help but note that it's UNDP that's sort of associated with the Human Development Index, which was intended 20 years ago to highlight the fact that growth alone, or income alone, should not be considered to be the measure of a country's success. And as you know, they added indices of longevity and literacy to try to broaden out the concept of human development. The most recent report actually introduces a set of additional potential indicators in their own right, an inequality index and a gender empowerment index, and what they call the multi-dimensional poverty index. So this can become, quite an exercise, but all with the right objective, I think, of trying to broaden the concept of what progress includes, and the obvious point that simply even economic growth, important as it is, doesn't necessarily translate into improved quality of life across the board. In fact, one of the interesting insights from this latest report is that a number of countries have made significant improvements on both literacy and longevity without having had substantial growth to show for it. Of course, a lot has to do with how widely distributed that growth is, as Jason was noting. But I think one of the problems is that we loosely use the term development as if we all know and agree on what that means and what it produces. And I mentioned the point about stabilization. But I think it's also true of some other areas of development. It gets back to your point about sectors or countries. You can make a tremendous impact in the health sector, for example. But if you don't find ways of creating the political institutions in a country that can maintain a decent health sector, or an education sector for that matter, not to mention job growth, it's probably not sustainable over the long haul. Or it's sustainable only with massive continued international investment in the sector. I would argue that development assistance without political development is only humanitarian assistance. And there's plenty to be said for humanitarian assistance, for keeping people alive, for educating people and so forth. But if somehow you don't build the sustainable political institutions to keep the society going, it's just a recipe for sort of a global entitlement environment in which countries become so dependent on outside assistance for their health and education that, and we can't afford that. I mean, I think the other problem, and I'm afraid it's true of the QDDR, is the QDDR is 2 years too late. You know, now we're in a budget environment in which a lot of those questions are moot. There won't be the funds to do a number of the things that state and USAID rightly would like to be able to do. So now the question is, how are they going to kind of revamp the objectives in light of a very constrained budget environment? And I won't blame it all on the House of Representatives, but I think it's a general problem we face. But it makes even more critical an understanding of what are we going to mean by development.
And just to put a fine point on that last comment, where whole initiatives that are trying to embody the kind of holistic thinking that Fred is talking about, global health initiative, Feed the Future, they're at risk because of the budget. So I think a lot of us agree with that point. Paul, you had it.
I just, again, there was some concern. I would talk to some of the people who were in the room when they decided that broad-based growth would be the phrase, and so they were telling me a little bit more of the background. And there was this concern that for some of us or others, it would echo the Washington consensus: growth, broad-based, how broad-based, etc. I just would point out that these issues of political empowerment and institutions, as well as growth and broad-based growth, are so critical right now. I was at a humanitarian conference and I didn't expect one of the organizers to mention land grabs. But we're talking about agricultural development, we're talking about Feed the Future, but what kind, and it's great to want to transform a society so that the incomes go up, particularly in the rural areas. But who, in this case, who has access to the land? And in the case of our current situation, which there's a lot of pressure on land, and according to some, there are a number of people who are saying land is being taken to produce various kinds of grains for developed or middle-income countries, in the case of Africa, and it doesn't seem that the governments are taking care to make sure it's broad-based. And that's an accusation we need to fill out with research and to see more. But that's one of those dangers in which you wanting to transform an agricultural sector and to grow it. We have to balance it with what does broad-based mean, and without the land tenure system, without some of those other balancing factors, it can be very difficult. And those are some of the dilemmas I think that we face. In the case of Madagascar, it was said to be a contributing factor to a coup d'etat of a president who decided that he wanted to make a deal with Daewoo for leasing huge grants of land in Madagascar. So just another cautionary tale about when we say broad-based development, and particularly transformation, what does that mean?
Max, did you have thoughts on this?
Just a very quick one, Paul. CARE has adopted, I don't know if you're aware, but CARE also has adopted an approach now where they are shifting from a project approach to a program approach. And it is also, if you look at the holistic picture, and not only at the national level, but also even at the community level, it's the recognition that you cannot achieve long-term sustainability if you do just one activity. You have to come in with other activities as well, including social engagement, what is a very important aspect of it, in order to make it sustainable in the long run. And one item, one little thing cannot do it. You need a package to do it. And I just want to highlight that I'm not talking about what used to be popular in the 80s, like integrated rural development. It's different from that, but nonetheless, you try to give a package of multiple activities to make things sustainable.
That's great. So one more question from me, and then I'm going to open it up. We're just at one. Just the last one that's been on my mind, and I wondered, you all work in organizations that cover much of the globe in different ways. If success is to be measured more on a country level, there is at least the potential concern that you will see a greater focus on countries which have the enabling conditions on the one hand, and then the hotspots that are too politically important to ignore on the other. And in between, you've got an awful lot of people living in poverty. And the fear that one might have if there's too much focus on a country level is what happens to those forgotten countries that are neither geostrategic and don't yet have proven capacity to succeed. They're not going to be the easy-to-tell stories in Congress or elsewhere. Are you seeing that in your own organizations, that you're finding it harder to get funding and support for some of those contexts? Should we all be worried about that, or am I overstating the case that people are still needs-based enough and willing to work with young, proven entities?
Just I'll take a first stab at it. Living in northeastern Brazil, a country which has, again, even several years ago, middle income, huge resources, human and otherwise, but the Northeast particularly poor, and there was actually an HDI for the Northeast, which would show that it was on a par with perhaps Guatemala or Haiti in terms of the level of poverty. So thinking about countries and where are the poor, they're going to be in some of these middle income countries. And so there may not be U.S. government grants for implementers, but then our job may become different. So I think that that's a very important one. But just to go back to your original question, yes, we are concerned that focus on the good performers. Performers, by the way, who maybe can get other funding besides the, again, Ghana, a star performer, should it get another Millennium Challenge, compact?
If oil, yes.
Or should it go to a country, in fact, which is neither geostrategic, as you say, nor a high performer. So I think it is a concern, and it goes back to why are we using aid and for what purpose? Also the idea that the good performers get solid development programming with country ownership, and the bad performers, or the not so good, well, they get quote-unquote humanitarian assistance. We know who practice emergency and rehabilitation reconstruction that there is, again, a continuum, but we're concerned a little bit about those categories possibly coming to the fore. We've also seen that post the Cold War, we thought that a lot of countries would be left out of Africa, but it turns out that there were geostrategic reasons to go back into a lot of other countries.
Lex, was that a pensive finger? Or?
No, well, no. I just want to give an example of Afghanistan, because I think it's interesting and it kind of is a response to your question. For a very long time in Afghanistan, there was a tendency of donors to fund the troubled provinces, and they would ignore the peaceful and quiet provinces. So basically what you were doing is you were rewarding bad behavior. So the peaceful and quiet provinces, as a result, became unstable, purposely or otherwise, became unstable as well, because that was the way to get funding.
I've got an idea.
Well, there you go. Start an evolution. But I think it is an important thing that we have to keep in mind. It's very easy for those countries in between to slip back into poverty, and that's why we should not ignore them and pay attention to that as well. And we should not be completely distracted by, on the one hand, the success cases, and on the other hand, the completely basket cases.
Jason and then Fred, and then we'll open it up.
I'm actually, it's a great question, and I'd be surprised if somebody hasn't run the numbers, but I haven't seen them, so I'm just going to speak anecdotally. Incentives matter, and for better or for worse, and again, sorry, I'm going to speak from the U.S. perspective, at least I know that for now. A desk officer or a country director or an office director inside the U.S. government bureaucracy has incentives to get money for his or her country or region. And we can all roll our eyes at bureaucracy or whatnot, but in a way, I think what you're seeing, you're sort of assured a floor of development funding, whether it goes over to MCC, whether it goes to AID or somewhere else. Incentives matter, and this structure actually creates an incentive for people to get money for their countries. How that's programmed, whether it's in a PEPFAR-esque manner or a project manner or budget support, or the president has a visit teed up, so let's do something special, that all gets sort of figured out later. But I'll be curious to see what the numbers say if sort of the really poor guys and the really sort of geostrategic. Plus, I would say one person's geostrategic country is another person's non-geostrategic country, depending on the time of day. And just one other anecdote. I mean, at the African Development Bank, what I had to go through over a year and a half was looking at both the replenishment of the African Development Fund, which is like IDA, the World Bank's IDA, and the recapitalization of the bank, which is for the middle income countries who borrow. And you're in an opportunity cost here because donors, particularly in a budget cycle, if they're going to give to the poorest of the poor, that dollar may not go to the middle income. But you know what? When you run the numbers in Africa, the greatest populations of poor, not necessarily the number of countries, but the greatest populations of poor are often in the middle income countries. So you're left with sort of a country versus individual poor dichotomy and trying to figure that out. Thanks.
That's great.
Working for the UN,
Working for the UN, there's a very strong value around universality and being everywhere. And so to some extent there's a constant sort of tension that goes on between donors who want to geographically target their assistance and push back from the agencies who are trying to broaden the impact and reach more countries. But it's nevertheless true that that aid these days tends to be crisis-driven, whether the crisis is AIDS or the crisis is a potential genocide or the crisis Islamic fundamentalism in a given place. That tends to be the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. And there's also a lot of gaming that recipient countries feel they have to go through in order to generate that kind of assistance. It's sort of like the old movie The Mouse That Roared, where the objective is you declare war on the United States and then you surrender and reap all the benefits of the aid that comes in after you've been defeated. Tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless there's a certain reality to this game that goes on. But nevertheless, so all the more reason to try to get the needs defined, get accurate data about where the real challenges are, and create expectations that not only resources, but political support and collaboration among outside countries, not just in ODA, but in trade and in other areas that are particularly critical for some of these countries to get their economies rolling, will address more parts of the bottom billion than just these crisis-driven issues of the moment, which I think we begin to realize that crises can morph into other kinds of crises if we don't address the basic issues.
Well, thanks. And we've just got 17 minutes. I'm going to make a request. Unless you really have a pressing engagement, we'd ask you to stay for the questions of your colleagues, and we promise to finish sharply at 1:30. So we're going to open it up to the floor now. We have some mics if you would like to have some help, and I think we're going to ask people to come up to the mics if you could. Or if you're a theater actor, feel free to stay where you are. But we have a question here and a question there. Yeah, please. And if you could make your questions, and you know what I mean by that would be great.
Thank you very much. I'm Joseph Dwyer from Management Sciences for Health. This was really very interesting, and the panel has such a wealth of information. So I'd be interested, from Lex to start with, and others maybe, if you think of either Nepal or any country you want to pick, but think of what's the situation now, and if you were to have a vision for success of what you'd call really country-led development over a 10-year period, what would be different from your vision in whatever country you want to pick?
Good question. Let's take some quick responses. I may not let everybody answer everything, and then we'll take the next question. Do you feel like you're ready for that?
Well, yeah, I can try to give an answer. Specifically, as far as Nepal is concerned, I think we're dealing in Nepal with a problem that is pretty much beyond the control of donors. There is a political inability, incompetence, quagmire that's very difficult to deal with. The donors are trying to support it through various types of programs, but we haven't gotten very far. Frankly, I don't know what is the way out at this moment to get Nepal back on the rails. You don't want to intervene too much because then it is foreign aid driven or foreign agency driven. So it's something where we have to, I guess, also allow the Nepalese to struggle a little bit with a still relatively new experiment with democracy. I mean, they only have had a multi-party system from 1991 basically, so it's not very long. the best we can do is at all levels, from the root level up, guide in good governance and support them in that way.
That's great. I'd love you to sneak in what you think success in South Sudan would be 10 years from now after what they've just been through, to another question. But it was a great question. Yeah, please go ahead.
It strikes me that one of the prime examples of country ownership is the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, and in particular the requirement that in order to qualify, the countries have to contribute 10% of their budget to their own agricultural development. So my question is whether this is in fact a useful mechanism, and to what degree can it be imitated in other sectors without putting undue budget pressure on the individual countries?
Great, please. Great question, thank you.
Yeah, I'll give an initial answer, and we're watching CADEP very closely because it's one of the ways that the Obama administration wants to implement Feed the Future is through regional organizations, and so CADEP has those requirements, and the idea that the government has to come up with a plan on its own, very important. Where we've seen it so far fall short is, again, the participation of non-governmental actors, and not just international agencies, but also local organizations. Again, this is an area that as we know, has gotten a lot more interest recently, but over the past 15 or 20 years, there's been woeful lack of attention to agriculture. But the fact that it is a regional organization and in which there is sharing between and among countries is a positive. What we haven't seen so far is the participation of those organizations that would also bring up those issues of land tenure and land grabs, bring up the issues of is it for export? Is it a palm oil plantation? Is it something which is going to affect cassava and those crops that poor people eat? So those are some of the challenges in terms of commenting on those government plans. On the other hand, we have also been asked by governments to comment on their plan, both our partners and CRS specifically. So I think that there's something very positive there, and it's, as always, is who are the watchdogs, or how is civil society connecting with the Africa Union or CADEP?
And just as our next presenter comes up, I would just ask the question, are we at our best when we impose policy conditionalities which tell countries exactly how or how much they have to invest, or are we at our best when we impose outcome conditionalities that says it's up to you to decide how your agricultural productivity improves the well-being of the poor? How much you invest is going to be up to yourselves. It's at least a question. Yeah, please.
Yeah, Lisa Gaylord, I'm with Wildlife Conservation Society, but spent the last 20 years in Madagascar, 18 of them with USAID, working on country-led ownership and donor coordination around the National Environmental Action Plan. And really put my heart into, really believed in the principles of that, but at the end of my tenure with USAID came to the conclusion that the problem was more with the donors in really moving that forward. And I served as president of the donor group for 5 years. And it's basically comes down to the programs that they're developing do not always align with the strategies of the countries, because the cycles often are off, even though we try to, through the National Environmental Action Plan, to keep those cycles, you know, in where everyone was working together. And so there's an incredible frustration on the part of the countries where the donors are coming in and they already have the Fed, you know, 12 or this or that, and they've already thought the thing through, driven more on what their needs. And I'm just wondering whether you're seeing a change, a shift, a real commitment to the Paris Declaration, where they really are trying to align strategies with host countries and not always having the political agendas and the agendas of the individual donors overriding really the real sense of country ownership.
So I didn't mention the one exception to the just ask a simple question thing. If you have years of experience and a really interesting story, that's allowed.
Okay,
Thank
sorry,
you. It was
sorry.
fantastic. We loved it. So I think we all would love to respond to it. So Fred, and did I see Lex? Did you want to say anything in response to it? Are we seeing a shift along the lines? And thanks for your really interesting comment.
Well, I think it's a key point, and of course, UNDP is sort of chairs the resident coordinator system for the UN system, at least, and tries through the UN Development Assistance Framework in each country to get engagement, connection between what the country's priorities are and what the donors think they're trying to accomplish. But it's an ongoing battle, and there are plenty of outliers who don't want to participate or have some other framework that they prefer to endorse We have another round, as you know, in Busan, Korea, coming up next fall about donor coordination and aid effectiveness and so forth. We'll see what kind of progress has been made since background. But it's just one of those things that everybody agrees would make a lot more sense if we could do it, but it's very hard to get everyone to kind of play in the same tent.
Yes. Jason, do you want to say something about that?
Sure, very quickly. It's a great question. I think it links back to the first question. What does successful country ownership look like? It probably looks like a country that has the capacity to actually raise its own revenues, or puts in place a plan to raise its own revenues. It has the transparency in its budget process to program that money transparently so that you can actually have donors confidently, including, when I say donors, I mean our Congress, I mean parliaments, I mean others, put money into a budget system so that you can get those cycles aligned, so that you can get people, not to just say we are committed to country ownership and the framework, but then to have the sort of bureaucratic programming mechanisms and funding streams that can literally put their money where their mouth is. So I think it's a great question. It's going to take some time, but I do think there's positive momentum towards that now, a little bit of shift in donor thinking as well as in host country thinking in many countries.
Thanks, did you?
Well, just a quick one on this. I think another problem, I fully agree, but another problem I think is it's simply the length of the cycles, the funding cycles. Organizations very often are expected to achieve capacity building and sustainability in 2-3 years' time, but it's totally and utterly unrealistic, and that is something I think where donors have to look into as well. You know, what do you really need in order to make something sustainable?
Okay, quick comment?
Just a quick comment. I mean, great question, Lisa. And I think the MCC, how did they get their deal?
Yeah.
You know, they have to report to Congress, but they do have multi-year compacts, and they're not necessarily questioned in the middle of it, stop building that road. Now maybe it is because half of it is infrastructure, but I think that's very interesting that if you make the grade to be a compact country, you have some guarantee, or at least a little bit more of a guarantee of continued funding. Because you're right, if you're out of cycle with a local government or a reforming government or a government that's challenged to deliver locally, as well as how do you show these very incredibly important indicators to a skeptical Congress after 1 or 2 years.
And my one comment in response to yours is that my cause of hope is that a vast majority of these finance ministers all seem to have watched Jerry Maguire. Because in the end of the day, what they say is, show me the money. And what I mean by that in terms of optimism is, as our systems for reporting what we're giving, where we're giving it, how we're giving it, get more transparent, some of which is being pushed by these aid effectiveness mechanisms, and people are sufficiently sophisticated about it, in the end of the day, it's control over where the money goes. I think we're moving in the direction of giving more nimble, more transparent, more coherent information to the decision makers at the recipient level who actually have to make those decisions. And if that happens, you'll get your goal in the end of the day. Coordination will get easier too because the data is all out there. Did you want to come up to the mic? And then here, and then there, and I think that'll be it. If you have a pressing question, please step up now because then we'll know how many people there are. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lauren Citron from the Center for International Private Enterprise. And that last question actually touched a bit on some of the better methods and practices we can use when doing development. My question, and I'm going to pose it in a series of if questions, because if you disagree with any of the ifs, then
Not too many ifs, though.
Not too many ifs. Well, it's if you believe that our job in this development community is to put ourselves out of business, ultimately. And if you believe that the thing we need most for something that's high up on our priorities is better political institutions, better political reforms so that countries can do their own development. And if you believe that to do that, governments need revenue to do their programs, and if you believe that that revenue will come from economic growth, specifically private sector-led growth, how do we get that kind of growth that is broad-based and that will lead to more growth in the future and won't be capped by other factors that could come up? Thank you.
Great question. So you think that's a good set of ifs? And what's your answer?
I'll give a very short answer to one of my colleagues. I don't believe that the entire goal of development is to put ourselves out of business. I think that you can disagree or agree, but the Supreme Court ruled that, political contributions are free speech. I think that the fact that we have development programs going on in China and other countries that perhaps don't need the money, part of development always will be as a means of engagement, and that's a positive thing. I mean, engagement is a positive thing, communication. So I'll turn it over to the colleagues for the rest of the questions.
So you have 3 ifs left, is basically what you're saying. Okay, but there's an argument that's being made there. Do you buy it?
I buy part of it. It's about development effectiveness. It's not about the aid. The aid is a very small part of the financial resources needed for development. So therefore, we're maybe not looking at the right part, and I think that's important. Global Financial Integrity, or another such group, estimated billions and billions and billions of dollars that are lost through transfer pricing or other ways in which money that's not being collected by developing country governments. So we need to focus on those things. I would say that the other way of thinking about the implementing, and yes, we in fact are trying to turn over programs to local partners in those situations in which we can, but implementing is really important for the human rights and the justice agenda that's part of development, and that doesn't apply to your GNP or your GDP. It also applies to disease and other factors which affect all of us, and so there's national security and other interests other than the moral and the justice part.
That's great. Just for time, because I was watching that clock, and Fred, please feel free to put your answer into the next question if you can. But that clock's a little slow, so I'm going to ask each of the 3 of you to ask your question if you could, and then ask the panelists to try and respond to them as we go. So if you could, please.
If you consider that we have this donor coordination,
Close to the
development
mic,
effectiveness, country ownership, broad-based development, which to me is more pertinent to the country itself than to the donors. What do you think to the proposal for this, proposal of the Center for Global Development, cash on delivery aid? Because that addresses everything you have been talking about. Have you even thought about it? What's your opinion?
Great question. What do we think of cash and delivery? I'll apply if others won't. Please.
Thank you. Leon Skoshinsky, Nathan Associates. I really enjoyed the talk about the performance indicators, success, and the likes, and Lex actually hit upon it. How do you measure success of a project when it's 1 to 3 years? And what I see on the ground is measurements such as Heritage Foundation or World Bank Doing Business. Doesn't take into cognizance the other donor activities going on, be it DFID, World Bank, or even other NGOs. Is that a fair measurement, and how do you think it can be improved? And I see there's a greater focus on this in USAID as we move forward. Thank you.
That's great. That's another question. How do we measure success with all of these new principles? Please.
We all know that large corporations such as the Coca-Colas, Pepsi's, Caterpillars, etc., are involved in aid and in the donor community. The question is to make, in many of these countries, in order to make it sustainable, it will mean reaching into a much, much larger segment of the population, particularly very small businesses. How are you, as NGOs or donor organizations, working with small business, say, in the United States and those countries, linking them to each other, which they do have many of which may have very similar interests, and in some cases, particularly very small businesses in the U.S. with innovative technology that may be startups, entrepreneurs themselves. It may be an opportunity to have a win-win situation. And does this become part of what the donor community or field community is
That's a
talking
super
about?
question too. So thanks, we've got 3. Cash on delivery, measuring success in this more complicated world, and the role of small, medium-sized enterprises. Fred, if you could speak to one of those, whichever is your favorite, and we'll try and spread it around before we go.
I'll pretend to speak to one and address all 3.
Exactly.
I think the whole question of private sector development is under-attended to in the conversations we've been having lately, but it has been an important part of what UNDP has been up to in addressing private sector issues. The best book I think that to read on the subject is the book by Baumol and Bob Lighton, Brookings, Bad Capitalism, Good Capitalism. Because what it really highlights is the ways in which government either enables economic development and economic performance or disables it. Most of my career was actually with large corporations trying to do business in the developing world, with AT&T, Microsoft, Cable and Wireless. And what is striking in doing that work is just how much the government can interfere with what would otherwise be sound approaches to economic performance. Often it's because established forces in the country who want to keep hold of the assets themselves and have no intention of allowing 100 flowers to bloom in the economy. But that's the point. If that's what the government does, you're going to end up with a system, it may be capitalism, but it's not the kind of capitalism that's going to be very productive. Conditional cash transfers is a very exciting development, and it's been, particularly in Brazil and now Mexico and increasingly in other places, addresses the poorest and has the prospect of making very poor people into productive citizens. It takes a fair amount of money, so not every country can afford to do it with its own resources, but it's something that I think all donors now are exploring the implications of it and trying to look for ways of
Excuse me, but
expanding.
isn't that,
I'll speak to the more specific. There's a relationship. Yeah. Go ahead, just.
I'll just grab one. Thanks. A little bit on sort of measuring success. I mean, I think you got to ask yourself, and sorry, but success of what? I mean, if you're looking at a project versus a program versus the country versus the sector, I mean, there is more movement in many countries that are looking more towards decentralization and whatnot. It gives you an ability to start getting down to a more local level and measuring things. Some of the tools that we see are, for instance, provincial competitiveness indices, which really can help to hold local leaders not only accountable, but create some transparency and good governance amongst a number of local leaders across the country and get civil society involved. And so some of these measurements, yes, they're good for measuring what worked, what didn't work, but they can also be tools to bring in others and to sort of promote country and local ownership.
That's great. Brief comments here?
Just what I saw in Brazil, the way in which, again, the local administrations, once the local civil society was able to break in, the 1988 Constitution, following the military dictatorship, created an incredible architecture, but again, was stymied at every level by the state and the municipality. But once there was a little bit more support to those local organizations, they were able to access funds, they were able to hold the municipal governments accountable, and really make a difference because the architecture was there. In that Brazil did it mainly on its own, but the conditional, and just again, not cash on delivery, but the conditional cash transfer, I saw a remarkable transformation by targeting the poorest. And that idea that you don't just go for the viable poor, but the poorest of a society, I think is a very important point. Corporations and small businesses, I think USA Forward and the new contracting mechanisms may allow more American small businesses. We used to call it the secret handshake of U.S. foreign policy. There's been the secret handshake of U.S. aid policy, in which relatively few organizations of certain kinds have been the intermediaries. I think that's going to be broken up, and I think what's important is that there's shape-shifting all around. With all kinds of public, private, not-for-profit, for-profit, social entrepreneurs, the crisis mapping that I am seeing, in which a gentleman working for a Kenyan software company is helping find people buried under rubble in Haiti, and it's all being done out of a basement somewhere in Canada. I mean, it's our world. So the small and the technologically savvy should be part of it.
Super. Lex, closing comments.
Okay, my last one. I do think that there are indeed a lot of opportunities and that we're trying to explore that, for small businesses and micro enterprises, how to link that up with the Western world. What I see in most of the countries where I've worked is that where it gets blocked is the bureaucracies, and that you can have actually in both countries. And sometimes it has to do with general trade agreements, etc. And we have to work together to get these blockages out of the way, and then I think there's tremendous potential there.
That's great. And just a little plug for the Centre for Global Development's Cash on Delivery program, which is an idea that they've put into a book. I think it's very powerful, very imaginative. Could we create mechanisms to reward countries for achieving outcomes in sectors like education, and so that as they improve educational outcomes, they get more money as a consequence, as a reward, and it incentivizes those kinds of behaviors? I think it's a great question, and it does speak to the kind of ways in which we can cultivate responsible country ownership, and I recommend all of you to read the book. I won't make a joke at their expense, I like CGD. Oxfam has lots of great stuff on ownership too, including a report on what it means, which you can get from our website. We'd be delighted. Listen, that for me was one of the best panels I've had the privilege to have a conversation with. I thought they demonstrated a breadth of experience, but I also thought the questions from all of you were fabulous too, and thank you very much for staying to the bitter end. And I think it actually wasn't that bitter. It was a really good discussion, and thank you for all of your participation.